Speak, O Lord, as we come to you to receive the food of your holy word.
Hey everyone, want to welcome you to the program. So glad you're on here. My name is Curtis Cooper, and I am the evangelist at the Stony Creek Church of Christ right here in Noblesville, Indiana. I'm so glad that you joined us. We've been reading through the book of Galatians. We're going to be looking at Galatians chapter 5. We're going to read the first 15 verses, and then we're going to talk about it. Let's begin in verse 1. He says, "Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Indeed, I, Paul, say to you that if you become circumcised, Christ will profit you nothing. And I testify again to every man who becomes circumcised that he is a debtor to keep the whole law. You have become estranged to Christ. You who attempt to be justified by the law, you have fallen from grace. For we, through the Spirit, eagerly wait for the hope of the righteousness by faith." He says, "For in Christ," in verse 6, "either circumcision or uncircumcision avails anything but faith working through love. You ran well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? This," he says, "this persuasion does not come from he who has called you. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. I have confidence in you, in the Lord, that you will have no other mind. But he who troubles you shall bear this judgment, whoever he is. And I, brethren, if I still preach circumcision, why do I still suffer persecution? Then the offense of the cross has ceased. And I could wish that those who trouble you would even cut themselves off. For you, brethren, have been called to liberty. Only do not use liberty as an opportunity of the flesh, but through love serve one another. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, that you should love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, beware lest you be consumed by one another." The very first verse here in this text really kind of summarizes what we talked about just in the previous text, talking about the bondwoman versus the free woman. And look at verse 1. He says, Christ has come freed us. There's a liberty in Christ from the bondage of sin and paganism and Judaism and the law. And so he says, be steadfast in that liberty. Do not let these false teachers drag you back to bondage. Why would you be entangled again in bondage anyway? He didn't want to liberate us so that we could go right back to slavery. He liberated us so that we could remain free in this life. And so Paul says, don't return to bondage by turning your back on Christ and then turning to Judaism. We need to resist any form of bondage. Should we not? We shouldn't reject the freedom that we have in Christ. So look there in verse 2. Look what he says that we will lose if we try to justify ourselves by the Old Testament. If they tried supplementing the gospel with circumcision. And so Paul says, if and when you do this, Christ profits you nothing. Jesus is either all or nothing to us. And so when we supplement Christ with something else, he loses all value to us. And maybe you're thinking, wow, maybe they were thinking, hey, look, we need to be circumcised just in case. It wouldn't hurt anything. But actuality, they're saying Christ's sacrifice is not enough. The gospel is not powerful enough. And they were actually abandoning Christ's sacrifice altogether. But Christ freed you, and yet you go back into slavery, you go back into bondage, you go right back into chains. Look at verse 3. What do you gain under circumcision? The whole law. You got to keep the whole law. You can't just pick and choose which law is your favorite, which one you're going to keep, like circumcision. You either follow the whole law or you don't follow it at all. That's why as Christians under the New Testament, we don't go back to the Old Testament to start justifying practices as we live under the New Testament. We got to go to the New Testament and find out what the Lord expects and what he's commanded us. Go back to Christ's doctrine. We're not Old Testament Jews. We are New Testament Christians who live under the teachings and the doctrines of Christ. Now look at verse 4. Because when we turn to the Old Testament, the result is we become estranged from Christ. He cuts us off. We can no longer be associated with him. He no longer knows us. We end up abandoning grace. You can't just try to justify ourselves by grace and by the law. We end up falling from grace. By the way, there are people who teach that can't happen, but not according to Paul. That's what these Christians were doing here in Galatia. Look there in verse 5. He says, but we, who's the we? Well, it's not the false teachers. It's not these Christians. Verse 4, he says, you've been estranged from Christ. You have fallen from grace. The we here is Paul and his companions, those who are faithful. He's encouraging these Galatian Christians that they need to do the same thing. And so he says, we trust and we wait in the Lord. We have the Spirit. We, through the Spirit, we wait by faith in the Lord. We put our trust and our hope in him so that he will save us. Look at verse 6. Under Christ, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything. What avails it anything in Christ? Well, faith through love. He'll talk more about that in verse 13. But notice faith, hope, and love. 3 things, basic things that God has asked from us. We can't really add or take away from those things. Look at the next section. Look at verse 7. 7 to 12, he says, you ran well, but they're not running well anymore. Why'd you stop? That's Paul's question. He says, why'd you stop running, or why'd you stop obeying the truth? He says, not because of the one who called you. This didn't come from God, or this wasn't God's will for them. This wasn't from Paul. The true answer was because of these false teachers. The influence of these Judaizer teachers. So in verse 9, a little false doctrine, a little leaven corrupts the whole gospel. A little leaven raises the whole lump. People start to think a little variation from the truth that doesn't hurt anything, but a little variation, changes more and more and more. It's a slippery slope. That's the way denominationalism works. That's why there's every flavor of denominationalism out there you could possibly want. And here's what's happening. They're allowing a few people, a little bit of doctrine in there that just running the whole lump. And Paul says, hey, look, you're allowing yourselves to be devoured. So in verse 10, Paul believes that even in the end, they'll remain in the Lord. He loves them. He's bearing with them. He believes and he hopes all things. He's trusting in the Lord. He believes they're going to turn back to the Lord. And so whoever's troubling them, notice back in chapter 1, verse 7, he says, there are some who are troubling you and want to pervert the gospel. Paul says they're going to be punished. They're going to be judged by the Lord. Whoever they are, Paul's not naming them by name because, he doesn't want to give them any ounce of credibility. But in verse 11, he says these false teachers are saying that Paul's preaching circumcision. Why would they say that? Well, they're lying. They like to say lies. They're deceiving their listeners. They're throwing a little mud at the wall, knowing it's not going to stick. They want to make a mark, trying to get people to start questioning things. And where might they have gotten that? Maybe it's because Paul circumcised Timothy. Maybe it's because they took something out of context, like where Paul says we are the circumcision in Christ. Paul circumcised people. Paul's talking about circumcision. And notice, what is the offense of the cross? Well, the cross should get us to no longer live for ourselves, but for him who died for us. The cross should get us to take up our own cross and deny ourselves. And if Paul's preaching circumcision, it eliminates the effects of the cross. It makes us start to think that we can do bits and pieces of that on our own. So in verse 12, remember circumcision is the removal of the flesh. He says Paul wishes that since they trust in the knife so much, that they would miss and end up cutting themselves off. That's really a picture of them castrating themselves. And that's a rather strong statement. But I think Paul's trying to show the seriousness of this and trying to grab their attention and the danger of these false teachers. So in verse 13, that this could be made into a 3-part sermon. And each one of them could be a lesson on their own. But I'm just going to kind of tell you a few of them. Look at number 1. He says you've been called to liberty. Liberty from what? What are we free from? From Satan, from Moses, the law of Moses, from the guilt, from this generation, from the control of our flesh. Then he says not to use as liberty as an opportunity to flesh. We need to use our liberty, our freedom, responsibly. In fact, flesh is part of the thing that most of us have been enslaved to. We have freedom in Christ from that. So we need to use our freedom not to be enslaved by our flesh. Human beings have often misused liberties and freedoms to do whatever they want to do for self-serving reasons. You rarely find somebody who wants to use their freedom or their whole lives to be indebted to anyone, let alone everyone, because notice the next phrase, but through love serve one another. That's the best way that we could use our freedom. Love that should motivate us to serve others. What's the difference between a young man who loves a girl versus a husband who's trapped in a marriage, both celebrating Valentine's Day? They both buy flowers and they buy candy, but not for the same reasons. And so we learn to use our freedoms to serve others motivated by love. God served us with love. And we need to serve others with a similar love or the same love that God loved us. Notice verse 14, how do we summarize one word that the law's fulfilled in? Love. Because if you love your neighbor, why wouldn't you steal from him? Why wouldn't you murder him? Why wouldn't you gossip about him? Why wouldn't you be overly critical and mean to him? Because you love. And so love leads to the same kinds of actions that obedience to the law requires. But love is better than obligation. And notice in verse 15, we'll summarize it. One, on the other hand, Paul warns us that, if we don't have love, we're going to start biting at each other. Eventually, we're going to consume each other. Ever been at a church like that where there's no love? People start consuming each other. That's so contrary to love. That's legalism, not love. Man, this is a powerful section. Man, Paul's really getting into some very deep things for us to consider. And especially as we get to the end of this chapter, there's going to be a lot for us to really think about and meditate on. I appreciate your time. Appreciate your attention. So glad that you were on here and willing to study and read through Galatians 5, the beginning here. Encourage you, please continue to read this. Think about it. Don't just put it down today. But I hope you have a great rest of your day, everybody. God bless everyone.